Neoclassical architecture is an architectural style produced by the neoclassical movement that began in the mid-18th century. In its purest form, it is a style principally derived from the architecture of classical antiquity, the Vitruvian principles, and the architecture of the Italian architect Andrea Palladio. In form, neoclassical architecture emphasizes the wall rather than chiaroscuro and maintains separate identities to each of its parts. The style is manifested both in its details as a reaction against the Rococo style of naturalistic ornament, and in its architectural formulae as an outgrowth of some classicizing features of late Baroque. Neoclassical architecture is still designed today, but may be labeled New Classical architecture for contemporary buildings. In Central and Eastern Europe, the style is usually referred to as classicism, while the newer revival styles of the 19th century until today are called neoclassical. History. Intellectually, neoclassicism was symptomatic of a desire to return to the perceived purity of the arts of Rome, to the more vague perception of ancient Greek arts and, to a lesser extent, 16th-century Renaissance classicism, which was also a source for academic late Baroque architecture. Many early 19th-century neoclassical architects were influenced by the drawings and projects of Étienne-Louis Boullée and Claude-Nicolas Ledoux. The many graphite drawings of Boullée and his students depict spare geometrical architecture that emulates the eternality of the universe. There are links between Boullée's ideas and Edmund Burke's conception of the sublime. Ledoux addressed the concept of architectural character, maintaining that a building should immediately communicate its function to the viewer. Taken literally, such ideas give rise to architecture parlante. Palladianism, a return to more classical architectural forms as a reaction to the Rococo style, can be detected in some European architecture of the earlier 18th century, most vividly represented in the Palladian architecture of Georgian Britain and Ireland. The Baroque style had never truly been to the English taste. Vitruvius Britannicus, Palladio's four books of architecture, De Reedificatoria, and the designs of Inigo Jones, with some additional designs. The most popular was the four-volume Vitruvius Britannicus by Colin Campbell. The book contained architectural prints of famous British buildings that had been inspired by the great architects from Vitruvius to Palladio. At first the book mainly featured the work of Inigo Jones, but the later tomes contained drawings and plans by Campbell and other 18th-century architects. Palladian architecture became well established in 18th-century Britain. At the forefront of the new school of design was the aristocratic architect Earl Richard Boyle, 3rd Earl of Burlington, in 1729. He and William Kent designed Chyzyk House. This house was a reinterpretation of Palladio's Villa Capra, but purified of 16th-century elements and ornament. This severe lack of ornamentation was to be a feature of the Palladianism. In 1734, William Kent and Lord Burlington designed one of England's finest examples of Palladian architecture with Holcombe Hall in Norfolk. The main block of this house followed Palladio's dictates quite closely, but Palladio's low, often detached, wings of farm buildings were elevated in significance. This classicizing vein was also detectable, to a lesser degree, in the late Baroque architecture in Paris, such as in Perrault's East Range of the Louvre. This shift was even visible in Rome at the redesigned facade for S. Giovanni and Laterano. Neoclassicism. By the mid-18th century, the movement broadened to incorporate a greater range of classical influences, including those from ancient Greece. The shift to neoclassical architecture is conventionally dated to the 1750s. It first gained influence in England and France. In England, Sir William Hamilton's excavations at Pompeii and other sites, the influence of the Grand Tour and the work of William Chambers and Robert Adam was pivotal in this regard. In France, the movement was propelled by a generation of French art students trained in Rome, and was influenced by the writings of Johann Joachim Winckelmann. The style was also adopted by progressive circles in other countries such as Sweden and Russia. International neoclassical architecture was exemplified in Carl Friedrich Schinkel's buildings, especially the Old Museum in Berlin, Sir John Soane's Bank of England in London, and the newly built White House and Capitol in Washington, D.C. of the nascent American Republic. The style was international. A second neoclassic wave, more severe, more studied and more consciously archaeological, is associated with the height of the Napoleonic Empire. In France, the first phase of neoclassicism was expressed in the Louis XVI style, and the second in the styles called Directoire, or Empire. The Rococo style remained popular in Italy until the Napoleonic regimes brought the new archaeological classicism, which was embraced as a political statement by young, progressive, urban Italians with republican leanings. In the decorative arts, neoclassicism is exemplified in French furniture of the Empire style, the English furniture of Chippendale, George Hepplewhite and Robert Adam, Wedgwood's bas-reliefs and black basaltes, vases, and the Biedermeier furniture of Austria. The Scottish architect Charles Cameron created palatial Italianate interiors for the German-born Catherine II the Great in St. Petersburg. Interior design indoors. Neoclassicism made a discovery of the genuine classic interior, inspired by the rediscoveries at Pompeii and Herculaneum. These had begun in the late 1740s, but only achieved a wide audience in the 1760s. With the first luxurious volumes of tightly controlled distribution of L'Antichità di Ercolano, the Antiquities of Herculaneum showed that even the most classicizing interiors of the Baroque, or the most Roman, rooms of William Kent were based on basilica and temple exterior architecture turned outside in, hence their often bombastic appearance to modern eyes. Pedimented window frames turned into gilded mirrors, fireplaces topped with temple fronts. The new interiors sought to recreate an authentically Roman and genuinely interior vocabulary. Techniques employed in the style included flatter, lighter motifs, sculptured in low-frieze light relief or painted in monotones en camargue, isolated medallions or vases or busts or bucrania or other motifs, suspended on swags of laurel or ribbon, with slender arabesques against backgrounds, perhaps, of Pompeii on red, or pale tints, or stone colors. The style in France was initially a Parisian style, the Gout Grec, not a court style. When Louis XVI acceded to the throne in 1774, Marie Antoinette, his fashion-loving queen, brought the Louis XVI style to court. However, there was no real attempt to employ the basic forms of Roman furniture until around the turn of the century, and furniture makers were more likely to borrow from ancient architecture, just as silversmiths were more likely to take from ancient pottery and stone carving than metalwork. Designers and craftsmen seem to have taken an almost perverse pleasure in transferring motifs from one medium to another. A new phase in neoclassical design was inaugurated by Robert and James Adam, who traveled in Italy and Dalmatia in the 1750s, observing the ruins of the classical world. On their return to Britain, they published a book entitled The Works in Architecture in installments between 1773 and 1779. This book of engraved designs made the Adam repertory available throughout Europe. The Adam brothers aimed to simplify the Rococo and Baroque styles which had been fashionable in the preceding decades, to bring what they felt to be a lighter and more elegant feel to Georgian houses. The works in architecture illustrated the main buildings the Adam brothers had worked on and crucially documented the interiors, furniture and fittings, designed by the Adams. Greek Revival. From about 1800, a fresh influx of Greek architectural examples, seen through the medium of etchings and engravings, gave a new impetus to neoclassicism. The Greek Revival. There was little to no direct knowledge of Greek civilization before the middle of the 18th century in Western Europe. when an expedition funded by the Society of Dilettanti in 1751 and led by James Stewart and Nicholas Revett began serious archaeological inquiry. Stewart was commissioned after his return from Greece by George Lyttelton to produce the first Greek building in England, the Garden Temple at Hagley Hall. A number of British architects in the second half of the century took up the expressive challenge of the Doric from their aristocratic patrons, including Joseph Bonomi and John Soane, but it was to remain the private enthusiasm of connoisseurs up to the first decade of the 19th century. Seen in its wider social context, Greek Revival architecture sounded a new note of sobriety and restraint in public buildings in Britain around 1800 as an assertion of nationalism, attendant on the Act of Union, the Napoleonic Wars, and the clamour for political reform. It was to be William Wilkins's winning design for the public competition for Downing College, Cambridge, that announced the Greek style was to be the dominant idiom in architecture. Wilkins and Robert Smirke went on to build some of the most important buildings of their era, including the Theatre Royal, Covent Garden, the General Post Office and the British Museum, Wilkins University College London and the National Gallery. In Scotland, Thomas Hamilton, in collaboration with the artists Andrew Wilson and Hugh Williams, created monuments and buildings of international significance, the Burns Monument at Alloway and the High School in Edinburgh. At the same time, the Empire style in France was a more grandiose wave of neoclassicism in architecture and the decorative arts. Mainly based on Imperial Roman styles, it originated in, and took its name from, the rule of Napoleon I in the First French Empire, where it was intended to idealize Napoleon's leadership in the French state. The style corresponds to the more bourgeois Biedermeier style in the German-speaking lands, Federal style in the United States, the Regency style in Britain, and the Napoleon style in Sweden. According to the art historian Hugh Honor, so far from being, as is sometimes supposed, the culmination of the neoclassical movement, the empire marks its rapid decline and transformation back once more into a mere antique revival, drained of all the high-minded ideas and force of conviction that had inspired its masterpieces. Neoclassicism continued to be a major force in academic art through the 19th century and beyond, a constant antithesis to Romanticism or Gothic revivals, although from the late 19th century on it had often been considered anti-modern, or even reactionary, in influential critical circles. The centers of several European cities, notably St. Petersburg and Munich, came to look much like museums of neoclassical architecture. Characteristics: high neoclassicism was an international movement. Though neoclassical architecture employed the same classical vocabulary as late Baroque architecture, it tended to emphasize its planar qualities, rather than sculptural volumes. Projections and recessions and their effects of light and shade were more flat. Sculptural bas-reliefs were flatter and tended to be enframed in friezes, tablets or panels. Its clearly articulated individual features were isolated rather than interpenetrating, autonomous and complete in themselves. Neoclassicism also influenced city planning. The ancient Romans had used a consolidated scheme for city planning for both defense and civil convenience. However, the roots of this scheme go back to even older civilizations. At its most basic, the grid system of streets, a central forum with city services, two main slightly wider boulevards, and the occasional diagonal street were characteristic of the very logical and orderly Roman design. Ancient facades and building layouts were oriented to these city design patterns, and they tended to work in proportion with the importance of public buildings. Many of these urban planning patterns found their way into the first modern planned cities of the 18th century. Exceptional examples include Karlsruhe and Washington, D.C. Not all planned cities and planned neighborhoods are designed on neoclassical principles. However, opposing models may be found in modernist designs exemplified by Brasilia, the Garden City movement, Levertowns, and New Urbanism.